And without a why, people fall apart. But if you find a why that's strong enough, that's powerful enough, it will motivate you to do everything, to take care of the physical aspect of yourself, to take care of the emotional aspect, the intellectual, the spiritual, the ethical, all of that. So I would say find that why.
The podcast that I recorded with Cary Friedman is actually pretty darn interesting. We dive into the power of storytelling, and he shares his years of being a spiritual leader as well as a religious leader. He spent time at Duke University. He's worked in prisons. He's worked over 25 years with law enforcement, especially with the FBI, but also with police officers as well. Yeah, I think it ends up being a pretty great episode. So give it a shot, check it out.
Welcome to the Winning Wellness Podcast. I'm your host, Mitch Schwartzman. I'm a family man, a coach, a wannabe athlete. After earning 3 master's degrees and countless certifications, I've decided that podcasting is how I'm going to continue my education in all things wellness, longevity, and performance. Join me to learn along.
I agree with you. That, what you're saying about the power of stories. I experienced it in my own life, and in my case, it wasn't just helpful. I've almost found it to be life-saving. A little bit of background: my mom is a Holocaust survivor, and she was 8 when the war started. She grew up in the city of Vilna in Lithuania. It was Lithuania at the time. And she went through horrors. Not the least of which was that she saw some of her family members murdered before her eyes. Remarkably, miraculously, by the time the war was over and some years after, she was reunited with her core family. Her father, mother, and brother all survived the war, albeit in different ways. All of them, some more than other, like hellish, nightmarish kind of experiences. Some of them met up in Europe. They found their way back to their home, to their community, their neighborhood, some in America. But with all of that, she didn't see this with her own parents, but all the rest of her family, aunts, uncles, many of those cousins were murdered. And my mother, in some cases, saw them murdered. In our home growing up, we had lots of aunts and uncles. They weren't really our aunts and uncles. It was a simulation of a family. They were people who had lost their own families, and then they had cobbled together some kind of a simulation of a family. I grew up in a small town in Connecticut, and that larger area in Connecticut, all the various survivors, they found themselves together, and this was our family. The trauma of that, growing up with that kind of baggage, being exposed to people. I knew a man, he should rest in peace. Before the war, he had a wife and 10 children. They were all murdered. And then he came to America. He remarried. They had 1 son. I'm friendly with him today. But to deal with the baggage of that would be more than a human being could do. And I know lots of people I'm in my early 60s. I have lots of contemporaries who grew up in those kind of homes. People deal with it in different ways. Some people just go a little crazy. What I did was I had the Batman. I had the Batman because here was a story of Bruce Wayne. At the age of 8, he witnessed the murder of his parents. It seemed kind of senseless, brutal, random. He had lived a life of ease, comfort, happiness, affluence before that, and suddenly his whole world was shattered. And the story of Batman is, how does somebody respond to that kind of tragedy? So for me, I worked out unbelievable amounts of trauma by reading the Batman story. And the story allowed me, shockingly enough, it enabled me to process through certain kinds of philosophical issues that I wouldn't have been able to do if I were talking about real people. Because at the end of everything, Bruce Wayne and all the people in his world, they're just composed of a bunch of dots on the page. There's four basic colors, and you can get a lot of stories and a lot of everything, but they're not real people. So in one of the stories, I remember when I was a kid, uh, the story is one of my favorite stories. It's certainly in the book, where there's a philosophical question. Robin is the voice in the story who poses it, and Dick Grayson is thinking, he's musing, and he's thinking, wait a second, what would have happened to Bruce Wayne? Like if his parents hadn't been killed, would he have grown up to be the lazy, spoiled playboy that he only now pretends to be? But maybe that's what he would have become. So if you think about it, it's a theological, philosophical question that's like unbelievable. What role does tragedy play in someone's life? In his case, it was the springboard, the jumping off point for him to live a life to become truly heroic, noble in all the ways that those stories portray him. And it would have been disrespectful, I think, to be thinking about real people like that. But I was a little kid, I was reading the stories, and I was thinking about those kinds of things, and it afforded me the mechanism, the opportunity to work out endless amounts of trauma and philosophical questions, theological questions that I don't know how I would have processed it otherwise. With the result that people, everybody loves Batman. Any decent, right-thinking person loves Batman. But I don't just love Batman. Like I'm obsessed with Batman, and it has formed my relationship with the Batman has formed more or less like the kind of framework of my life. Just about everything that I do, I have to phrase these things very carefully because if I say them incorrectly or if I overstate the case, people think like you're such a weirdo. You're such, it's so immature. But I invoke the Batman. I had a long career. I was a consultant to the FBI's behavioral science unit for many years, in large part thanks to the Batman. And if I was on the grounds, I was in Quantico and I was teaching, I had to be very careful how I ever invoked any of these kind of images, because if it's silly and it's Batman is, no different than than Richie Rich or Hello Kitty, so then, we're in a lot of trouble because these people aren't joking around. My old boss in the behavioral science unit used to say, you have to be very careful. We live in the darkest place any human being could live. We're in that darkest place, and it has to be treated with respect, and there has to be like a measure of, just of caution, So, but if you use the story properly, like you're saying with your kids, you can use it to inspire, to teach, to elevate. I'm always amazed. The book came out almost 20 years ago, and over the course of these last 20 years, I have gotten countless communications from people who run various martial arts schools, and they incorporate the material. At the beginning of each session, they share some kind of an idea, or at the end of the session, they'll share something about the path of the warrior. The book has been used in schools for autistic kids because apparently they do very well with very concrete kind of examples, stories, guidance, illustrations, and the Batman mythology, Batman character certainly provides that. It's been used in all kinds of different ways. And like I said, I use it with my work in the law enforcement community. Hopefully I'll tell you a little bit more about that. But anyway, so that's the beginning. That's the beginning of my lifelong association with the Batman. This was for me, very, very serious stuff. And here we are.
Thank you for sharing. I'm excited to dive into a couple of different branches of things. I think before we bite into some more of that, I think I'll share. I have also kind of, I'm maybe one generation lower and off to the side of Holocaust survivor exposure. So my stepfather from Israel, his mother is a Holocaust survivor.
Oh,
His father as well. He ended up growing up in Haifa in a community where his generation was all the children of Holocaust survivors. And so a lot of the framework of how they saw the world with oh gosh, they just had some trust issues, I guess.
right.
Some trust issues and some survival coping mechanisms. They kind of got passed down to him because he was raised by a community of people who had gone through all that trauma. and then I saw how he was acting in the world and his relationships and things like that many years later. And I just thought that's just so interesting because at first when I was a teenager and met him, I couldn't understand that. And then 20 years later, I started to like reflect and kind of think like, oh, I think I kind of understand why you are the way you are a little bit.
Uh, Interesting.
But I think those are the stories, and the framework that we have designed our brain to kind of see the world and experience things. Um, but yeah, I think I get a little bit of
So you get it, right?
I think I get a little bit of that relation there, and seeing yeah. So a lot of things to talk about there. You could talk about how tough the survivors are that come out of the traumatic situations there that survive, and that it just kind of gives them a little bit of their own superpower to uh, stay alive. I think there's some really interesting, the the medical list of things that he would tell me about his mother had going on, that she fought through in her older age. Pretty pretty impressive. Um, but I guess let's move on past that a little bit.
Well, just
Please.
what you comment, I just want to share one story, if I may. Um, when we would have, if it was the Jewish holidays, so we would have that family gathered together. If it was Thanksgiving, we would have that simulated, that larger family, the extended family gathered together. And a typical conversation, I always wondered, what did regular families talk about? Because I remember one Thanksgiving, I was 8, and the conversation somehow came around, and everyone went around the room. And these people, if you look at them physically, they didn't look formidable. Sometimes they were, the man would be 5'2" and rather slight. But the conversation with the question would be, what's the closest you ever came to being discovered by the Nazis and killed? Things like that. So they'd go around and they would tell these stories, and they were harrowing. I would be listening. I was looking. I have an older brother who's 10 years older, and my brother, my father, he should rest in peace. My father passed away 12 years ago. My father was born in America. His parents came from Europe when they were little, in the early 1900s. But my father was a regular American who had married this survivor who'd come to America. And my father was 6'3" and 280 pounds. He was a big, formidable man. And they would go around the table, and I would hear these stories of people getting close to a Nazi checkpoint. They had hidden away under a blanket or something in the back of a truck, a carriage or something, and they're quick thinking what they did. And they would describe a combination of like ingenuity and of brazenness and cleverness and faith in God and everything. And my father would turn to us, and I was a little kid. I was 8. When this story took place, like I said, my dad was 6'3" and 280 pounds, and he turned to us and he said, "These people are unbelievable. The strength of them." He said, "If we were there, we would have been the first people, we'd have been wiped out right away." He didn't mean to give me that message, but I grew up with this message, this sense of, gosh, like almost an intrinsic weakness, something that I had. And part of the reason, part of the draw of the Batman for me was at the first possible opportunity, as soon as I was able, my parents were allowed, I started working out. They said I had to wait till I was 13. I started working out. I've worked out every week since then. That's almost 50 years ago. I've worked out every week. I studied martial arts. I have a reasonably high degree certification in Shaolin Kung Fu, and I was going to respond to that essential, existential, like that intrinsic weakness that he declared that I had, and I was going to triumph over that. And it was just like those kind of images hung in my, just loomed everywhere. And the Batman played that role of inspiration. and I would be doing something, and this sounds so ridiculous, but you'll understand. If I was practicing Tai Chi or doing Qigong or Gung Fu, whatever it was, if I was so, my eyes would be closed, and I would imagine like I'm in the Shaolin Temple in the Hunan province on that mountain at the base of heaven. And, if I were to look over to my left, my good friend Bruce Wayne is right there. And I grew up that way. And that got me through a lot of times when I didn't feel like working out. I just didn't feel like it. And I didn't feel like it. I would think to myself, like, I don't have the luxury to miss that, and I'm not going to. And when you say about, the toughness, my mom just about to she turns 96 next week. She should live and be well. And she's had some health issues, and it's the strength, that indomitable will. That's the real strength. That's the real strength. She has it, and those people had it.
A few things to bounce off of that. Have you heard? From what I understand, this is a fairly recent kind of I'll call it a piece of knowledge. Have you heard the anterior mid-cingulate cortex? It's part of our brain. Has that come across your
No.
plate at all? Okay, so you take the average human being and you start having them do like push-ups in the morning or cold showers, or they're getting uncomfortable. There's a part of your brain called the anterior mid-cingulate cortex. When you choose repeatedly to do hard things, that tissue will actually grow in size, kind of like a muscle. And it is the portion of your brain that is willpower. You're developing your willpower. They also find people who have been through tough situations. I think the Holocaust is probably about as unfortunately, a great example. When you talk about making those decisions and doing things that are tough, but promote survival, anterior mid-cingulate cortex growth is promoted. In survival situations, such as when the body's on its last leg, you might have somebody in the what do you call it, hospice situation. Individuals who have highly developed anterior mid-cingulate cortexes, they sustain and they survive longer and further than people who do not. So the willpower you have earlier in life becomes your will to live later on in life, or in medical traumas earlier in life.
That's amazing. I'm going to track that down. Track that down.
It's
when you first, I'm sorry, go ahead, finish what you say.
I was just going to say it's a fun piece of anatomy where we're developing something we can't see, and then it has this apparently tremendous payoff.
Amazing. When I teach my police students, so we talk about developing that reservoir, like increasing the amount of willpower in order to one of the things that I teach is ethical decision making. So I use that analogy. I talk about willpower developing it's like a muscle. What you're saying is it's not just a very nice image, it's real. And I love it. I'm going to track that down.
Yeah.
I thought when you first started talking, I thought you were going to go somewhere else, which is that one of my kids some years ago seemed to be like a little distracted in class or something. So some teacher, somebody, well-meaning, no question about it, but they directed us to somebody, and they want us to have his brain mapped. I think that was the term. So we took him to some clinic, some or whatever, and they attached some stuff, and they, over the course, they go through a spectrum of a number of different frequencies, and they map the brain, and the printout comes out with like this cartoony shape of a brain, and there were a few lines here and there, and they say, like in an ideal case, there'd be no lines, but if there's some of these lines, they represent maybe connections that are inhibiting, that are detrimental or something. But, the paper was white. So, okay. And they said, if in fact there was like there are different degrees of distress, it could be a little yellow if the brain is like on alert, or it could turn to orange, to red or something. And, but they said, oh, your kid, nothing really here. nothing like, whoever it was like false alarm. They were getting all nervous. Maybe he's just bored in class because he's smart and he's done this stuff already, whatever. So I said, wait a minute. I want this. I want to have my brain mapped. Like I want to know. So they were like, well, we don't usually deal with older people. And I was like, no, but I want. So they set me up and they go through all these different frequencies and all these printouts. And my brain across all the frequencies, like the paper, like the cartoony drawing, it was all deep red, like bright red. So the technician who was doing it said to me, I've been doing this for a number of years. He said, I've never seen, he said, the term we use is this is a brain that's giddy on hypervigilance. And he said, what would be, he's like, I mean, I've seen something close to this. He said, like in rape victims, people who have survived traumatic. He's like, how on earth? Because I show up, I look like a, more or less harmless, boring guy. And he said, how on earth do you have this? So I said to him, well, I'm a Holocaust survivor child. And he was like, okay, got it. He's like, oh, okay. Oh, okay. And like, mystery solved. But that term of like giddy, brain giddy on hypervigilance. So when I deal with my comp students, and hypervigilance is certainly a part of, it helps them, it gets them into trouble. It plays a lot of roles in their lives and in their careers. I say to them like, yeah, I understand. I understand what that means. But you took it in a different direction. And what you're describing, like that part of the brain, such an interesting, provocative. I'm going to track that down. Thank you.
And not to get competitive with Batman, however, there is a book called The Rise of Superman.
Okay.
maybe Daniel Kaufman wrote it. It is all about, I bring it up not just to talk about more superheroes, which is I'm fine with that too. When you describe those, I forget what word you use. When you describe those horrendous stories about people almost getting caught and surviving, and you talk about them making smart decisions and being having ingenuity and surviving the situation, Daniel Kaufman has written a book about people doing that in extreme. It's talking about entering flow states. Oh. The whole book is about flow states.
Interesting. It's so interesting.
But the book specializes in extreme sports, where they're skydiving or they're surfing big waves, or they are doing something on a trail or a half pipe or something like that, where they can repeat the situation. Like they can make a mistake and then 2 minutes later come back and try again in a controlled setting. But one of the situations he talks about a guy by the name of Laird Hamilton, and Laird Hamilton has been like a front runner on this surfing big waves. So he would go out on a wave where when you make a mistake, that's the last time anybody's going to see you. And so he would put himself in life and death situations, and he would invent new surfing techniques when his life depended on it. And the book goes into a little bit of I'll call it like psychophysiology of what the brain is doing and how it's creating those different capacities and how it's rising to the occasion. But I think
remarkable.
I think, unfortunately, the horrendous stories, I think there's maybe something going on in the brain in that point where you're problem solving because you have to, and your brain is becoming superhuman in those moments.
Right.
Yeah.
Interesting. For me, just by the way, I need to say this like almost as a disclaimer at the beginning. When I talk about Batman, I make this point increasingly nowadays. When I talk about Batman and my love for the Batman, my obsession with the Batman, the role that Batman has played in my life, and from the communications I've gotten from people in the lives of lots of people, I have endless amounts of communications from people who read the book or have seen me on different TV shows, and they tell me what role it played in their lives. But the Batman I'm talking about is the Batman of Once Upon a Time. I can't really say a lot about what goes on in the comic books today. I stopped reading some time ago because we live we live in a different world than the one in which I grew up. The world today is just so pornographic. It's so valueless. It's immoral. It's violent. It's brutal. It's senseless. It's just very different. And the Batman I first encountered, whether it was in the 1960s TV show or the comic books of written by Denny O'Neil, drawn by Neil Adams, or Steve Englehart and Marshall Rogers, those kind of people. There were great, great writers. Bob Kane and Bill Finger, the people who created the Batman, Jerry Robinson, they had a certain way of looking at the world. And I could point to those and I could recommend someone to read them without any kind of reservation. A number of years ago, I just realized how brutal things had gotten and the kind of portrayal of not even adult, even adults should blush if they were to encounter these things, and to see them in the comic books. And apparently ostensibly, like, kids are buying the comic books. I had to kind of, sadly, I walked away. So I don't, anything that I'm saying, what I would say is if somebody wants to know who Batman is, there's old trade paperbacks, paperbacks of the old ones, or they should watch the early 1990s animated adventures, which I believe to be the high point of Western civilization. Those were perfection. And the idea of translating from the comic book to another medium, that was the first, probably the only time that I ever saw it done so well. I mean, that's the Batman. When I'm talking about the Batman, it's like, Kevin Conroy's voice is there. It's that.
I am vengeance. I am the night. I am Batman.
It's that artwork. It's those values. So I just really want to put that out there so nobody misunderstands. Because if they go and they take something off the shelves nowadays, they'll look and they'll go, "That's what this guy's peddling." Like, ooh, it seems a little. So I have to always be very careful about that.
Yeah, the early 90s version was my introduction and indoctrination. That's where I'm glued to the TV for that.
Okay. Look how well you turned out. There you go.
for probably some pretty important years of child development. That's one of my big things of being on TV there.
Okay.
But yeah, and just like, but yeah, I think that these stories they're teaching us, how it's hard to be a teacher and to entertain and provide these stories in certain ways. But the cartoons can do it so well, especially for the younger generation. But it's great to have it to actually teach you something. And my goal is, so I have a master's degree in counseling, and when I was going through my counseling education, I never heard the words narrative and therapy put together. Nobody told me about that. But as soon as I'm done with all of my coursework and I'm doing interning, I'm talking to one of my intern coordinators, and I kind of say, what I don't like about therapy and what I've been taught about is everything is always problem based. I want to talk about the solution, and they're like, "Oh, you mean solution therapy?" I'm like, "Wait, nobody told me about solution therapy. I've never heard those two words put together." And then I'm talking to him more, and I find out another one. So then my next intern, so my first intern supervisor, he talks a little bit about that, the problem, but then he tries to get people solution focused right away. He wants to train their brain. Let's solve the problem. Yeah, we had that trauma. We have those bad habits and patterns. Let's rewire you and be solution focused. My next internship coordinator, he's literally writing books about the movie Field of Dreams and how it relates to mental health. And he's using narrative therapy with people. And so I just started thinking, like, okay, these stories are pretty important. And then a handful of years later, I start becoming, I'm a father, and then the kids are wanting stories. And I see how I can teach them stories, or I can teach them lessons through storytelling so much faster than I can with like wagging my finger and like scolding them or anything like that. So
Right.
it just it makes for a massive impact.
You'll appreciate there's a movie, there's a documentary back 2011, I think it was. Fellow called me up, fellow from Florida. His name is Brett Culp. He's a great guy. And he called me up and he said, I read your book. He said, I really enjoyed it. And he said, I take it you take this stuff pretty seriously. And I was like, oh yeah, I do. So he said, so do I. He said, I do too. He said, I read your book. And he said, I've got young children. And he said, and I'm struck by the power of storytelling in general and the story of the Batman, the mythology of the Batman in particular. He said, what's your sense? He said, you think a lot of people think along those lines? And I said, I had been a few years earlier, I was speaking on the History Channel, had a program called something like Unmasking the Dark Knight, the Psychology of the Batman, something like that. It was from 2008. And I said, I think a lot of people think this way because I was on there and just about, everybody and their brother got in touch with me, telling me their stories. And for many years, the book came out at the end of 2006, and people started writing to me. And I spent years, the first many years, I would try to verify these stories. Someone would describe to me something which life had dealt them a hand that was so tough. And they would describe to me how the inspiration of the Batman helped them. And they would say, look, the Batman could do it. I can. And if you understand, like we're talking on the same level, you understand why that's not silly. Like someone said, it's just a cartoon, it's a comic book. What are you talking about? But they understood because the Batman, if it's compelling, which I think the character is, it's because it is bringing to life certain fundamental themes that really exist. We'll have to talk about what those, try to identify what those themes are. But if those themes are correct and the Batman is a dramatic illustration of them, it's going to resonate with people and it's going to provide a source of inspiration. So I had to stop at some point after, years of trying to look into people's lives to verify. I would Google stuff, I would find things, and I would verify, like, it's true what they're saying. And they would describe to me how they triumphed over tragedy, adversity, over heartbreak. It was incredible. So now it was a number of years later, it was I think 2011, and Brett Culp said to me, you've found this community of people for whom this is real, this is important. I said, absolutely. There's a lot of them out there. So he said, I'd like to create a documentary that explores the power of storytelling in general and the power of the Batman story in particular. So he interviewed a bunch of people, and the documentary, it's called Legends of the Night. I can't recommend it enough. There's a movie maker, his name is Kevin Smith. I think he's like an independent, like a colorful kind of guy. He describes himself, he's kind of he's a Batman, he's a huge Batman fan. So, and he has some kind of a podcast, I think it was, he had for a long time, where he would be talking about Batman. So he saw Legends of the Night, and he wrote in some article that he wrote, he said, it's my third, I think he listed as number 3. It's his number 3 top Batman movie. He said, just because there isn't some dramatization, some story, there's no supervillain. He said, it's not about that. He says, it's channeling pure accessing the power of Batman. And what Brett did was to interview the documentary. He interviews all kinds of people. He interviews about 6 people who have gone through tough things. One of them was a little boy who had cancer, and the Batman's pretty tough. So is this guy, and they would use this imagery in his town. He dressed up as Batman. He teamed up with the police. They stopped a bank robbery from the Riddler, things like that. It was magnificent. And you can't keep a dry eye in this documentary. It's unbelievable. But one of the people whom they present is Travis Langley. He's a professor of psychology somewhere in the South. I don't remember now exactly where. And he wrote a book called, I think it's called Psychology and Batman. And he talks about how he's teaching psychological concepts, and he brings, because everything's better with Batman. this is good. It's better with Batman. You add Batman, it's good. So he talked about and then they brought in a few counselors, therapists who use Batman in their counseling sessions. So what you were describing about, becoming acquainted with these things afterwards, these people were kind of making it up as they went along, and they were using Batman, their own love for Batman, and they would say, oh, this person's experience, it will resonate. And it resonates. Boy, does it resonate. So I think the book, so the documentary, so Brett created it. And then a couple of years later, he produced another documentary. I think it was called something like Look Up to the Sky, something like that, about Superman. And you mentioned this a few minutes ago, and I was struck by the fact that they have very, very different tones, because what each superhero represents, they're wildly different, wildly different. Both of them are fighting for justice, and both of them embody all kinds of positive values. But for me, when I was growing up, Superman held absolutely no value for me. He wasn't of interest to me at all. The Batman got me out of bed early in the morning because there were push-ups to be done. There were sit-ups. There was I majored in electrical engineering in college because I would need to have that kind of a background if I was going to do whatever it was that I was going to do to fight crime. So the Superman, I used to look and think like, I wasn't born on Krypton, and there's no red sun, there's no yellow sun, there's, nothing like that. If I had this gift of unearned power, I think I would use it well, I think. But nobody gave me, in fact, the image that I had was like my dad's of, we're so weak, we would have been wiped out right away. So that whole, to explore that, you were saying about the power of stories. Brett Culp is a gold mine, those two movies, and especially, I'm most familiar with Legends of the Night. It will open up a whole world of what you're describing, the narrative therapy, using these kind of images, so powerful and effective.
Can you go more into your professional life? You studied electrical engineering, and then somehow you become a psychological consultant with the FBI. How do we bridge that gap? What's going on?
All right. The way that you bridge it is because the Almighty has a sense of humor. It's the only way to say it. It's the only way. I have a bachelor's and a master's in electrical engineering. And I worked in industry. I worked for General Electric and another company. I worked in the field of like military electronics for, I think a total of about 5 years. And I did some teaching, like religious teaching. We lived in different communities, my wife and I, and then our children. We lived in different places, and I would do some religious teaching. And while I had absolutely no problem, I could justify philosophically being involved in, I worked in GE in Syracuse a long time ago in their military electronic systems operation. And a strong United States, that's a great thing. This country should be strong. God bless America. I love this country. And the idea of a strong military and whatever kind of toys they need, the gizmos they need to keep us free and safe, no problem with that. And GE has a motto. The motto was like, we bring good things to life. I think that's the motto. So in our division, some of the people sometimes, it was either comically or cynically, they would say things like, we bring good things to death. I didn't like that because I thought it was cynical. But the fact is that we were ensuring that America had the things that it needed, the resources, the tools to play the role that it plays in the world and keeps its citizens safe. But at the same time, the hope always was that anything that we were making would never be used. So I could imagine, I knew a fellow, he worked at GE, it was over 30 years. And he said to me one time, he said, I'm due to retire next January. He said, this project, whatever it was they were creating, he said, I came on a year after they started. I've been working out the entire time. I'm going to retire in January. It won't be done for another 2 years, they project. So he said, I never really saw anything from I'm like, oh, that's a little tough. So I was doing some teaching. I was teaching like high school kids, things like that. And I felt pretty good. I thought that in a really, in a real way, I was impacting people in in their lives as they're growing up at a meaningful point. And I'm actually bringing good things to life. I'm helping them become the noblest version of themselves that they can be. So I decided to go into the rabbinate, and I switched careers. I went back to rabbinical school for a number of years. My wife is a really good sport. She's a really good sport. She married an engineer. She wasn't banking on that, but I went to yeshiva for a whole bunch of years and ended up becoming a rabbi. I was the rabbi at Duke University for a number of years, and I was teaching courses to the kids. They were either they were either official college classes or they were just, I was on the campus. I was part of the religious life staff. There were 27 different religious groups represented on the campus, and I was one of those 27 chaplains. So I did that for a while, and while I was doing that, I was a prison chaplain at the FCI Butner down in right near Durham, and we then moved to New Jersey. We came back closer to the Northeast where our families live. And I was a congregational rabbi for a number of years. I was once representing my community, my congregation. I was speaking at some kind of community event. And I finished speaking, and it was something, I believe, patriotic, something to do with America. Was it the 4th of July? I don't remember. It was Memorial Day. It was something, celebrating veterans. I don't remember, but I gave a little talk. And when I finished, a fellow came up to me and he introduced himself as the chief of the behavioral science unit of the FBI. So a little bit surprised by that. What's he doing here? He happened to be in this little community at this little event for whatever reason it was. He happened to be there. I think he was going from Quantico maybe to something in New York. He ended up here. Unbelievable. So he said, what you said was very inspirational. It was very substantive. He said, I understood everything that you said. He said it was very, very spiritual and it was inspirational. He says it wasn't religious at all. He said, but it was still very moving. It was very inspiring. And I was like, what's he getting at? I really didn't understand what point is he making? He kept saying to me, it was very spiritual, but it wasn't religious. So I was like, is that a good thing? Is that a bad thing? So then he introduced himself. He said to me, can you do that consistently? Like, do you have a lot of that kind of stuff? And I said, yeah, I think I modulate my message depending on what kind of an audience, I'm addressing. I can speak either like in lots of religious jargon, or I can speak regularly. So he introduced himself as the chief, and he said, we're working on a project for the last number of years, 5 years, trying to identify what he called tools for intentional spirituality. They had done all kinds of research. The behavioral science unit always used, like they're the unit that created the art and science of profiling back in the late 70s into the 80s. People like John Douglas and Robert Ressler, some of these people, giants from the BSU, they used the tools of behavioral science to support the fight against crime. So they had been tasked by the Department of Justice to figure out why it is that police officers, there are all kinds of sad statistics of the career, the incidence of alcohol and substance abuse, domestic violence, the incidence of all kinds of organic diseases, the most dramatic, of course, the suicide rate. There are forms of stomach cancer that are unique to the police profession. And the Department of Justice noted the fact that for 30 years, from the mid-60s to the mid-90s, they had thrown all kinds of resources. They had developed disciplines of the discipline of police psychology with all of the tools and insights and practitioners and resources. Wonderful stuff. And yet, for all of that, those statistics hadn't really gone down very much. The rates in the mid-60s and the rates to the mid-90s of alcohol and substance abuse were about the same. The rates of the incidence of organic diseases, the suicide rates, they're about the same. The suicide rate for police officers in the United States, through the roof. A police officer is 8 times more likely to kill him or herself than to die at the hands of a bad guy. That's like shocking. There's an expression they say that, at the end of the day, the person most likely to kill the cop is still the cop. So the Department of Justice said to the Behavioral Science Unit, how come? We've thrown all these resources, this whole discipline of police psychology. Why isn't it working? If you look at the same period of time from 65 to 95, what you find is that the line of duty deaths, the number of police officers killed in the line of duty, dropped dramatically because of improvements in technology, the bulletproof vest being widely available. And then there was like a Kevlar, then double weave, then triple weave. The technology improves and the training improved. How they do an unknown risk traffic stop, or how they respond to a domestic violence, which is, which is the most dangerous. It's so unpredictable. So because of those technology and training and other kinds of reasons, the number of officers killed every year had plummeted. Thank God. We'd like it to go to zero, God willing, but it was much, much less. But during that same period of time, the other statistics stayed constant. So they said to the Behavioral Science Unit, why? They did all kinds of research, which is fascinating what they did, but beyond the scope of this conversation. And they came back and they said the field of policing, the profession, is stressful and challenging and dangerous. Of course, it's stressful and challenging and dangerous physically. Everybody knew that. It's also psychologically and emotionally, that's true. And they realized that. But they said there's another dimension. And all those resources, if you're throwing all those resources, but you don't address that other aspect of the career, and it's also stressful and challenging and dangerous spiritually. And they said, if that aspect isn't being addressed, if you're not providing resources to the cops with which they can nurture themselves, they can keep themselves strong on the spiritual plane, the other resources aren't going to help, the other infusions. So the Department of Justice said, what? Like, what is that even spiritual? So they had to tease it out because we live in a country, thank God, that has church-state separation. You can't be peddling religion. So they said, come up with tools for intentional spirituality. They spent a lot of years thrashing around trying to come up with that, and they couldn't really find the boundary between spiritual and religious. They just couldn't do it because people they would enlist to help them would be peddling religion. You can't peddle religion on the grounds of the FBI Academy in Quantico. You can't be creating resources and booklets and training films that is pushing religious values. So the program was kind of teeter-tottering and they weren't sure what to do with it when the chief happened to hear me talk. And he said to me, what you said was very spiritual. You weren't talking religion at all. He said, if I closed my eyes and I didn't see your yarmulke on you, he said, I wouldn't have even realized that you're an Orthodox Jew. So he said, can you do that? Can you come up with materials for us? And I said, I think so. So he said, well, one talk isn't really a lot. It's not enough for me to know that you got these credentials. He says, what could you show me? What do you have that could show me, that could convince me that you can talk about highfalutin ideas? Ideological, idealism and things like integrity without invoking religion. So I said to him, well, I have this manuscript that I wrote about Batman, and I identify the spiritual values, the moral philosophy that emerges from the Batman mythology. So he said, you're kidding, right? So I said, no, I have it in manuscript form. I wrote it while I was the rabbi at Duke because I used to use Batman to help me illustrate philosophical ideas. So he said, can you send it to me? So I sent it to him. It was in manuscript form. And he called me up and he said, you got the job. He said, we'd like you to come down to Quantico. He said, I read the whole book. He said, you weren't peddling religion, but you were talking solid spirituality. He said, we need to be able to help police officers preside over nurturing and nourishing, strengthening their sources, the sources of their own idealism and their integrity. And he said, he says, I'm convinced you can do that. He said, so can you come down? I went down a few days later. I was there for 2 years interviewing police officers at their National Academy, police officers, not just FBI agents, but police officers from local, state, federal levels from around the world. They invite people to this National Academy program. And I ended up working with them. I worked with the Behavioral Science Unit from spring of 2000. And the last time I was there teaching at the National Academy was in 2017. I wrote a book for them. I created a course called Spiritual Survival for Law Enforcement, which is the distillation of a course I created for the National Academy. This book is used as a basic textbook all over the country, thank God. It's the law enforcement version of Wisdom from the Batcave. So when Dr. Band invited me to come down, he said to me, I wanted to come down on 2 conditions. I said, okay, what's that? He said, first of all, get a haircut. My hair was way too long. And I said, okay. He said, don't ever tell anybody that your familiarity with law enforcement, your expertise flows from your familiarity with the Batman. And I said to him, I won't breathe a word. Now that I've been doing it for so many years and I have credentials to, I can rely on those, I invoke the Batman. And I created a book, came out 5 years ago, which is the merging. It's the superhero handbook for cops. And I use the Batman mythology throughout that image and other superheroes as well. But I merge the two, always making sure that we're talking not on a level of silliness. You understand, but I'm just, I don't have to say this, but that we're talking about identifying what is the core of the character. Why is this character so inspirational? Why is it so inspirational, people? I've encountered this. I've spoken at Comic-Con. I've spoken in all kinds of places, and people, I'm introduced someone and they'll say, oh, he's an expert on Batman, an expert. I love Batman. People will come over to me and they'll say, oh, you love Batman? Like, so you must have all the action figures. And I say to them, no, I do 200 sit-ups every day in the morning. And they're like, what? That doesn't make, what's the connection? You're laughing because you get it. That's the disconnect. And with the cops, I have to bridge that. I didn't do that for, I've been doing it now. I've been working with law enforcement for 26 years. This past January was 26 years. I didn't invoke any superhero stuff until about 6, 7, 8 years ago. I always played it straight. But now that I have a name, people know who I am, and my material's out there, I'll bring those things in, and people will say to me, oh, yeah, because I became a cop. When I first started, I knew a guy who was a legendary FBI agent. He taught in Quantico. He was just towards the end of his retirement. This guy was larger than life. He was just what a police officer, like a law enforcement should be. He had entered the career because they're very spiritual, and they enter to become like the noblest versions of themselves. The motivation is purely spiritual, like to do good in the world, to protect the innocent from those who would prey on them, to create that thin blue line of decency, to protect, our society from chaos. These guys at their noblest are unreal. So this guy was larger than life. So one day we were talking, and I said to him, John, so he says, when I was a kid, we used to listen to the Lone Ranger on the radio. He said, and that silver bullet was a symbol of integrity, of the immutability of justice, the uncompromising, the purity of justice and decency and right. He said, and that's what I want it to be. If you think about that, the power of these fictional characters. I dedicated the Spiritual Survival book to a number of people who portrayed law enforcement officers, right? I dedicated to Bob Kane and Bill Finger, the fathers of the Batman, Clayton Moore, who was the Lone Ranger, Guy Williams, who was Zorro. In other words, this was my introduction to heroism when I was a kid. Robert Stack, who was Elliot Ness on The Untouchables. Jack Lord was Steve McGarrett on Hawaii Five-0. Ephraim Zimbalist Jr. was Inspector Louis Erskine in the FBI, the 1960s TV show, The FBI. Clint Eastwood, don't have to explain who he is. Inspector Harry Callahan. Adam West, who played Batman. And Kyle Chandler. That was a show my kids introduced me to in the late 90s. They were watching, I guess, in reruns or something. The TV show was, it was about a fellow who gets tomorrow's newspaper the day before. I'll try to think of it. Anyway, yeah. I sent the book to all of those people. And a number of them, like some of them weren't alive. So like Guy Williams, I sent it to Guy Williams Jr. And every one of these people, if they were still around, somebody or their families, like they got in touch with me. Guy Williams Jr. wrote me a letter. Ephraim Zimbalist Jr. called me on the phone. which was like unbelievable because I'd watched the FBI when I was a kid, and he was, he was a hero of mine. And Adam West wrote me a letter, and Ephraim Zimbalist Jr. said to me, I just portrayed a hero on TV. He said, but I'm an actor. He says, you're a real hero. He says, you minister, you strengthen real life heroic men and women to do the work of law enforcement, to keep them honest, to ensure that they remain idealistic, that they have integrity. He said, you're the hero here. He says, these people are the heroes. It was such a kind thing. Adam West. So to anyone who responded to me, I said to them, would you look at my Batman book, the manuscript? Would you give me a blurb? Ephraim Zimbalist Jr., if you look in the book, you'll see he gave me a blurb. When I first said to him, he said to me, wait, you're kidding, right? He said, it's kind of, and Ephraim Zimbalist Jr. was the voice of Alfred in the cartoons in the 90s.
Oh, nice. Yeah. Okay.
So he said to me, he says, like, what idealism is that? So I said, I'm going to send a manuscript. So you'll see the blurb. If you look back, you'll see why he wrote what he did. Got in touch with him. And he was like, I never realized. Adam West, who was Batman in that kind of campy TV show, I was too young to realize they were playing it for laughs. So when I was 9, 10, 11, every Wednesday, my mom took me to the public library. And in one of the episodes, Batman, the key was knowing about the biographies of all these famous composers. So I slavishly worked through for a couple of years. I knew everything about the lives of Mozart and Beethoven and Chopin, because I didn't realize. I thought I'd have to know the works of William Shakespeare, because he'd be quoting the bad bookworm was saying something like, I didn't realize. Adam West, we had a conversation on the phone one day, and he said to me, after he read the manuscript, he said, I'm absolutely shocked. He said, I didn't realize. He said, we thought it was like we were playing it for laughs and stuff. He said, but you've made sense of something in my life. He says, I have gone all over the world, certainly all over the country. He said, and I'm recognizable. He said, sometimes I'm in an event. Sometimes I'm in an airport. He says, I've had chiefs of police, heads of detectives, homicide detectives, the head of the SWAT team, fire marshals. He said, people have come up to me in the airports, at conferences, the security working for someplace, and they'll say to me, I entered law enforcement. I became a first responder because of you, because of the example you set. And Adam West said to me, I looked at him, I think, what are they, crazy? He said, I never understood. He's like, I thought the whole thing was we were playing it for laughs. He said, when I read the book, he said, and I began to realize that what we were doing is, even at the level where we were playing it, it was like kind of whimsical. He said there was a core where we were channeling, we were like tapping into the reservoir of the raw power of what the Batman represents. He said, and it resonated with people. They were responding to that. He said, so I was in Chicago once, this is a long time ago, he says, and the head of the homicide detectives said to him, I entered law enforcement because of you. He says, now that great mystery of my life has been solved. And I said to him, how many times have you had that happen? So he was quiet for a while, and he said to me, I would say at least 450 times. He said, I've had the experience of someone coming over and saying to me, you have no idea the role you played in my life. Interesting.
Yeah.
But that's the power of the Batman character. And I don't think maybe I'm not objective in this, but I think it's unique to the Batman mythology. There are certain themes of Batman that don't exist with other comic book characters, other fictional characters. People always point to the fact that Batman has no superpowers. If he doesn't do those push-ups, if he's mastered 127 different types of martial arts, of combat styles, that takes a lot of work. I have struggled with one in my life, and he, through sheer the force of his will and the hard work. And the flip side, that's premised on an idea. It's a religious idea. Certainly in my faith system, this is one of the major axioms, the tenets, which is like the endless, the infinite potential, the limitless potential of the human being. We're created, the Bible says we're created in the image of God. And what that does, at least, we think about what the consequences, what are the implications of that, is that we possess limitless potential. If we make demands of ourselves every time we go back to the well and we take the bucket and we put it down, we spin it, we'll always come up with more resources. There's more water there. The well is endless. It just goes, it doesn't run dry. And if we make demands of ourselves, the more we do that, we never say, like, I've reached the end of what I can do. And I think that is one of the fundamental foundation, the premises on which Batman is built, is that idea that what it means to be a human being, we don't really ever really think about that. We think, I've had people say to me, sometimes I chastise, I'll be at a police conference and I'll see my police students horsing around in the lobby or something at night. And this happened to me a few years ago. I was in Chicago, I was in a hotel, and we'd had a whole long day of training. And then I see the guys horsing around in the lobby. Really horse around. One of them grabbed a potted plant and pulled the tree out, and he's brandishing it. There's roots, there's dirt. And I said to him, Ryan, what? So he says, hey, he says, I'm only human. And I felt like weeping. I said, do you have any idea what it means to be human? Like the limitless potential, the nobility of which we're capable, the dignity. And like the story is built on that idea. Bruce Wayne, just as a human being, he's not a Kryptonian. No radioactive spider has bitten him, like nothing like that. And yet what he can do. So that is I think that's one of the fundamental principles, the basis, because very few of us can create an exoskeleton and repulsor rays and be able to, fight evil as Iron Man or something. And we don't have an adamantium exoskeleton. Like we just don't have that. But it's like, if we're willing to put in the time, and if we set our alarm clocks an hour and a half earlier than we otherwise would, there's a lot to accomplish. So I think that's one of the main reasons for the Batman's attractiveness to people, because anybody can relate to that. All you got to be able to do this, all you have to do is you just got to want it. You just got to want it. There are a few other ideas. I mean, in the book, I try to identify what those reasons are, and I identify, I think, 18 of them. They're all pretty good principles. There are probably a handful, 3, 4, 5, that are really defining of the character in any incarnation, whoever was writing it. When the book came out, when it came out, when I first wrote it, I sent it to DC Comics. And Denny O'Neil, you should rest in peace. He passed away a few years ago. Such a great man. He was in charge of Batman for over 30 years. And after the comic book, after the TV show in the 60s, and it became all campy, there was a backlash. Like, it was super popular. And then it just crashed. Batman was on twice a week. It was used to, I think, on Wednesday, Thursday. They'd have a 2-part, like I think the third year, and the cliffhanger, and they would resolve it. And then the fad passed. And Batman comics they were in danger of canceling it. Denny O'Neil took over the writing chores, and he rediscovered, like, he went back to the old Batman, the creature of the night, the detective, hugging the shadows, and he saved everything. And he was in charge of Batman for a lot of years. So in 2000, I sent the book in. I mailed it in one afternoon. We lived in New Jersey. And I sent it in, and I sent it to DC Comics one afternoon. The next night, my phone rang. One of my kids answered the phone and said, it's some guy, Dennis O'Neil, for you. So I just assumed it was my friend Jonathan, who plays tricks and everything. And I was like, Jonathan, you fool, like that. And he's like, hi, this is Dennis O'Neil. And I was like, no, come on. And it was Dennis O'Neil. So I said, how on earth how's that? How are you calling? I said, I sent this in yesterday. He was the group editor of the Batman line. They put out in any given month like 15 titles. He wrote a number of them. He edited the other ones. He supervised the whole thing. I said, how's it even possible? So he said, the book came today. He says, I get 7 bags of mail a day. Like those large bags, he said, I get 7 bags a day. He said, so they deliver them. He says, and I would drown. He said, so what I do is I open up and I get rid of all the outer packaging. I get rid of all the outer packaging and I distill it. He says, like, then the letters, the contents like that, he says, is a fraction of that. He said, so I opened your package. I don't remember what the title was. It had some working title, but I identified at the bottom, it said Rabbi Cary Friedman. He said, so I thought, on the book now, it just says Cary Friedman. So he said, I thought, what would a rabbi have? So he said, so I started reading it. He said, it took me about an hour and a half to read. He said, and he said, I just want you to know something. He said, I'm an Irish Catholic. He said, I understand that you are Jewish. I said, right. He said, other than a phrase here, a word or two that I might have used, I would have formulated a little differently. He says, what you just wrote, he said, that's my philosophy of life. He said, it's why I entered comic books. He said, I was a journalist. I was a newspaper, I was a reporter. He said, and I was something of a novelist. He said, and I was idealistic. And I wanted to impact on American culture. He said, so I was very strategic about it. I did a lot of thinking and I thought, I want to impact. When are people most impressionable? When they're young. And what are they reading? They're not reading the newspapers. They're not reading novels. They're reading comic books. He said, so I entered the field of comic books. I became a comic book writer in order to share my moral philosophy with America, with America's youth. I wanted to impact. Isn't that unbelievable? So
Yeah.
sometime later, I asked him about that, and he said, everybody has an agenda. He said, everybody who's writing comic book, he says, they have an agenda. They want to make sure that the kids know that big companies are evil, or they want them to know this or that. He said, everyone has an agenda. He said, I tried not to peddle politics, but I tried to peddle decency. He said, and when I was reading your book, and a lot of the stories I bring in, he wrote. The illustrations I use, he wrote. So he said to me, when I was reading your book, I thought, this is my worldview, and this is what I'm saying. He says, and I took the liberty. He said, I pulled out the wire, the spiral bound stuff. He said, I sent it to our graphic arts, like the copying department. He said, and I ordered 40 copies of this to be made. He said, I sent it to all of the current crop of writers and artists on Batman. He said, we have like about 15 titles a month. He said, and I said to them, this is my vision of the Batman. This is my vision. He said, I want you to stay true to this. No one has ever given me a finer compliment. I was so honored. I was so honored by that. But it was interesting. He said, I wanted to impact, and this was the way to do it. He says, and I've seen that I've had that impact. He said it about himself. So that was kind of interesting.
That's fantastic. That's a great story. Glad to hear the stars aligned there.
Yeah, it was amazing to me. I once met Jerry Robinson shortly before he passed away. And Jerry Robinson was the guy. He was like right at the beginning. He knew Bob Kane and Bill Finger. I think Jerry Robinson created the Joker and maybe Robin and the utility belt. Like he added to the mythology. So I tracked him down and he was speaking somewhere in New York City. I went to see him. I think he was like at a Barnes and Noble in Manhattan. So I introduced myself and I showed him the book. It was just about to come out. I showed him like the galleys and stuff like that. So I said, would you look at it? He was an old man. He said, hard for me, but I will. So we spoke about 10 days later and he said to me, they would have loved this book. He said, Bob Kane and Bill Finger, he said they were given the assignment after the initial huge success of Superman. They were supposed to, DC wanted, it wasn't DC in those days, it was like National Periodical Publication, something like that. And they were given the assignment, create another blockbuster. So he said they were batting ideas around, they were saying stuff. And he said that, this is how I put it, he said, they talked in these ideas, these kind of terms. He said they were talking about these high-minded, philosophical, these moral ideas, what they wanted the character to represent. He said, I think they would have loved this book. And that, to me, obviously was very meaningful.
How do we create maybe not a blockbuster that everybody takes on, but how do we create a different story or different narratives to steer people? So I have two children at home. I've done okay for a couple years in teasing some lessons and interweaving it in there. But I'm a strength coach on a university campus. I'm a teacher as well. So I could use some advice on storytelling because I want to teach my athletes how to be healthier and how to win, and I want to teach my students how to take in this information more easily. And I need to become more entertaining because now they have the most entertaining thing in the world in their pocket, and I'm like, I'm okay, but I cannot compete with the internet. So, have you picked up any trends or tips or advice for creating storylines to sell your knowledge and your know-how?
I'll tell you, I have not found any character that has the same kind of broad spectrum of appeal, the broad spectrum appeal that Batman has. We were talking earlier about some of the dark undertones that can exist, and people can certainly find that. It's possible to relate to the character without those kinds of things. And I think that I mentioned before when I taught at Duke, I was teaching religious topics. I was talking about morality, ethics. So they didn't want to hear my abstruse, esoteric texts that are 3,500 years old, 2,000 years old. They would be like, they'd be rolling their eyes. And I would bring in, I got permission from DC Comics. I'd bring in and I'd put a page of a Batman comic book in front of all my students. And there'd be some issue, some exchange, some event portrayed in the thing. Batman would be dangling a guy off the roof of a 20-story building, and he would say to him, look, you tell me what I want to know or I'm going to drop you. No Miranda rights, no constitutional rights, nothing like that. So we would have some kind of conversation about the extent, like the law, you bend it, but at some point it breaks. What are the parameters? What are the limits? And, I'd pose a question and we would be discussing, and then I would segue and I would slide a piece from some religious text in front of them. And I'd say, the conversation continues here. This might be in Aramaic or it's in Hebrew or something, but it's essentially the same one. And the position that you are championing, Stephanie, belongs to this particular commentator. And Matt, you were saying that, well, that's this one. And they would continue the conversation, maybe a little bit more on a rarefied level or more something, whatever it was, more, whatever, however you want to define it. And that was very effective. And that was the reason why, like, those students used to say to me, would you write those intros up? The introduction you gave us became this book. That's really this book.
Yeah.
So depending on who the audience is, you can play up certain things about, his origins and how does one respond to tragedy. But I think that's one of the, I mentioned to you just a moment ago that I think one of the important themes is the limitless potential of a human being. I think that resonates with people. They desperately want to know that about themselves. And if you hold up that, I talk about in my work with the police officers, I always say that my job is to hold up a magic mirror. And I hold it up in front of them and I say, look inside here and I want you to see who you really are. And what I do is I strip away all the externalities to show them who they are, why they went into the career, profoundly spiritual motivations. You ask a cadet, why do you want to be a police officer before they let them into the academy? If they say, I want to beat people up, you don't take that. If they say, I want to, the only answer that helps, the only answer that gets them in is, I want to help people. I want to stand for something. I want to be the living embodiment that translates the Constitution of the United States from just words to actual reality, to temper the exercise of force. Can you imagine that? It's shocking. The Constitution says police officers, they can't barge into your house. They can do anything they want. It tempers the exercise of force. Shocking. And these people, these men and women, they're the embodiment of that. They protect the innocent from those predators who would prey on them. All those kinds of things. When I put it in those terms and I introduce them to themselves, they're like, oh yeah, that's right. That's who I am. And they're energized. When you introduce a young person and you say to them, your potential, it's not like, oh, I'm just human. No, oh my gosh, you're human. the nobility of that, the dignity of which you're capable, the limitless potential you possess to do anything, to do anything. So that's an important idea. The next idea, which is as important, and this is the key to everything, is that there's something fundamental in a human being, a need to live for something larger than oneself. If you say to a human being, here's a lot of money, here's a pool, here's an Olympic-sized swimming pool, here's a lounge chair, you can relax, it's sunny out today, here's a fancy drink with a little umbrella in it, here's an ice cream sandwich, relax, just enjoy yourself. Something fundamental in a human being, in the human spirit, if you want to call it the soul, withers and dies. People have to live for something larger than themselves, than their own ease and comfort. And when people are put into situations where demands are made on them, what we think in America, in Western civilization in the 21st century is, don't make demands on the kids. Don't expect them to play up. You set the bar high. Don't do that. They're lazy. They want to be loved. None of that's true. What they desperately are, what they're thirsting for, their souls are thirsting for, is meaning. To live for something larger than their own ease and comfort. If you just say, here, I'm going to offer you endless amounts of ease and comfort, they wither, they die, they starve to death as human beings. I've seen this on college campuses. I was on college campuses. I worked for many years. I've seen it with children. I've seen it with my own children. I've seen it in every context, with the cops, when I was a prison chaplain. In every possible way, a human being, and that's, in this context, I would recommend Viktor Frankl's book, Man's Search for Meaning. An unbelievable book, unbelievable. And what he talks about in there, the whole basis of Frankl created the third Viennese school of psychology called logotherapy. The premise of that is people need to have meaning in their lives. So when you say, like, there's all these things out there, kids could sit with their phones and they can watch TikTok videos of cats for a bajillion hours. And at first, their first immediate reaction, they'll say, like, I want to do that because it makes no demands on me. And I can just veg out. I can go on automatic pilot. And that's what I want to do. At some point, something in them, like, they're not at peace. They're not happy. And if you push back and you say, really, that's not an option. Here's an option. There's good works to be done. There's kindness to be done. You see that older man over there, the one who lives across the street? It just snowed and he can't shovel his walkway. Someone needs to do that. I'm volunteering you. And there's a lot of good, and they have a sense, if you give a kid a taste of their own power, and they feel the power coursing through them to accomplish, to do good in the world, what they say is, oh, I feel fully alive. That's what I want. That's what I want to do. And what the Batman represents for those people who love him is this sense, the ultimate sense of meaning, because that's the trifecta. Those are the three principles. It's the limitless potential of the human being, the need to live a life of meaning, of profound meaning, not frivolous meaning. It's not some little kind of silly thing like, I want to get a good job and make a lot of money. That won't nourish any soul ever. But to give someone real meaning, to stand for justice, for decency, to fight for the good in this world, to stand up against evil, those are kinds of things. Those are themes. That's meaning that's large enough. And the third one we mentioned was, how does one respond to tragedy? How does one respond? My mom went through the war and she came out, and what she said to herself was, I'm going to increase the amount of good in the world. I'm going to do kindness every single possible way that I can. She was a public school teacher for close to 40 years. She collected food in a very, very poor part of town. She collected food. She collected clothing. She took these kids and they made sure they had medical care. She did everything she possibly could. And she enlisted an army of people. She created a network of people. They visited shut-ins, elderly people. And she always says that's her response to the darkness, was that if you say to kids, there's work to be done and you can accomplish. There's something unique. Every one of us in my religious faith system, it teaches this. Every person is created They're endowed with unique gifts that nobody else has. So it's not just a one size fits all, like you got to do what's right. And here's like a formula. It's cut and dried. It's easy. It's one size fits all. Nothing like that. There's work to be done. You figure out what your unique talents, your strengths are, your gifts. The Creator gave you those gifts. Use them in some meaningful way. How are you going to live up to be worthy of that gift? And then there's a minister, I don't remember his name, but he said, what God gives you, that's God's gift to you. What you make of yourself with those gifts, that's your gift to God. And if you say those kind of things to young people, because they've forgotten, and society is colluding not to remind them and to get them to sit and veg out and betray the fundamental humanity that they have. If you say to somebody, there's work to be done, and you are uniquely qualified, you're the only one who lives in this corner of the universe where you are, you're the only one who can do this job. Identify what your talents are, figure out what your mission is, and then stay focused and do it. I'll just say one last thing because I am such a blabbermouth, but I'll tell you one last thing. I found, especially after Legends of the Night came out, I was flooded with letters, either letters, old school, or emails, communications from people. And like I said before, they had tough lives. They had been dealt really, really tough hands. And what I found, though, was that they were psychologically and spiritually much healthier than most of the people with whom I interact in the general population or on a college campus, because the fact of there having been, one young woman wrote to me, her sister had been murdered, and she became an advocate for families who were going through the justice system like they were living this nightmare. Now, that's tough. It's heartbreaking. She had lost a sister, but her life was filled with meaning in a profound way that most people don't have. And as it turned out, she was in many ways healthier than a lot of the people with whom I interacted. When I was, like I mentioned, when I was at Duke, there was a woman who was in the brain cancer there. Duke is famous for dealing with brain cancer. She was in the cancers, and she was an advocate for families who were there while a loved one was going through stuff. I said to her one time, I said, Rachel, how do you do it? How do you do it? You're extraordinarily effective. You're so talented. She said, my child died here a number of years ago. She said, I've been right where they are, so I can play that role. That's the response to tragedy. That's having meaning, and that's having limitless potential. They're not so like, I can't do it. She can do it. You give that. That's the formula for success for your students, for your kids, for everybody. And that's the power of Batman. That's really what Batman is all about.
You're kind of speaking on hardship and on how we need to be challenged. I got into this show called Alone a few years ago, and Alone is like they send people out in the wilderness to just live by themselves. It's like a dozen people, they're all scavenging and hunting and fishing and like whatever. And I found a pattern there where the people who they maybe found like a sweet spot where they can live and they're comfortable and things like that. The people who get it good like right away, they have like whatever, they scrounge mushrooms or potatoes or whatever, and they're fishing and like everything is going good. They're officially not going to die. They don't win. They don't win the show. The people that go in and it's terrible and they suffer and they're just starving right from the get-go, they don't win. It's the people in the middle who suffer, but they're just successful enough that it's always a challenge. You don't want to go in and have it easy and then you're just sitting in the woods for a few months, because those people psychologically can't handle it. And you don't want to go in and just starve because you can't make it. You want to be somewhere in the middle where life pretty much sucks, but you're gonna make it. If you tried really hard, you're gonna make it. So a lot of what you're speaking on there, it made me think that you don't want to be without challenge and without hardship, but too easy of a life, you create your own problems and you spiral in the wrong direction. So I just kind of think when you were speaking on it, I just thought, I was like, yeah, that really reminds me of the show Alone, where people's minds break down. Their mind breaks down if it's too easy, and their body breaks down if it's too hard. But in the middle, they flourish, and they'll stay out there for months of they just camp. They're just living out in the woods for months to be the last one standing to make the cash prize at the end.
That's very interesting. I think what you've just done is to identify there are a number of ingredients that you need to be successful. Because if someone is overwhelmed with hardship, with tragedy, if they haven't been trained, because most people don't think in these kind of terms. Nietzsche, not exactly the person I think I would have imagined would be the source for this quote, but Friedrich Nietzsche said that one who has a strong enough why can survive any how. And I find that to be so powerful. And the idea of, and what I try to do with the police officers is to remind them of their why. For a lot of them, they weren't aware of it, not consciously. Some instinct brought them to the police training academy and they entered the career, but it wasn't articulated. They can't formulate it. They can't express it, which means that it can get pushed aside and pushed to the back. That's not good. A person has to have a clearly formulated and articulate. They have to be, somebody once said, a person can live in the shadow of an idea without grasping it. That's never enough. For success in life, a person has to not live in the shadow and fail to grasp. They have to grasp it. And they have to live in the sunshine of the idea. So if a person can clarify for themselves, what is their why? What is their why? And that might take some doing. Sometimes people have whys. And I think what you said before is interesting too, because it has to be a challenge. It has to be worthy of them. If things are too easy, if the fight for survival is not significant, so that doesn't provide enough inspiration to keep them going. So I think a large part of parenting and of educators is to give young people, and if we haven't been given it by someone else, we have to do it to ourselves. A lot of times we have to parent ourselves and to identify for ourselves, to clarify, like, what is my why? Like, why do I exist? I use that as a technique with my police officer students. We write various kinds of things like core values, mission statement, credos, various kinds of written documents that they can use and they can refer back to them to clarify for themselves, like, what is their why? Sometimes people have whys that are a little small. They're very, very small, or they're unworthy to really provide. I was reading a book one time, a psychology book by Dr. Anthony Storr, who was a British psychologist. And he wrote a number of books. I loved all of his books. But in one of them, he was talking about the fact that when he looked at the statistics in England, the rates of depression plummeted during World War time. He said that before World War II, England had like an epidemic of depression in all the different ways that this young science of psychology, psychotherapy, could measure it. And whatever the causes were, it was pretty high throughout British society. He said World War II came along. They were fighting for their national survival and their individual survival. England got clobbered. The Nazis were bombing them. They were doing everything they possibly could to avoid that. They were relocating the population to the countryside. I mean, it was an existential threat to their, very existence, to their continued existence as a nation, as people. He said the rates of depression plummeted. He said, because there can probably be no finer, more meaningful source of meaning than to live, to continue to live. Now, the truth is there are values. There are values that are higher than a person's life, because there are people who are willing to sacrifice their lives, soldiers or first responders. But soldiers will go, and they're not driven. I've done some work with the military, and I've heard people say things. I have a colleague and a friend. I'm proud to call him my friend. I hope he thinks of me that way also. Commander Eric Potterat was chief force psychologist for the Navy SEALs out in California for over 20 years. And he produced Navy SEALs, strong, primarily strong up here. indomitable wills. And he would talk to me. We've talked over the years about the kind of things that they taught them. And they didn't do what they do because of hatred of the enemy. That doesn't provide much of a why, but love of country, love of God, love of family, protecting the American way of life. At its noblest, the American way of life is magnificent. No country like this one ever. It's unbelievable. So to protect what's really truly American, the essence of it, that's what they give these Navy SEALs. And when they go out and they say to themselves, I'm fighting to protect my family, my loved ones, the ones who are back there, to make sure that America in its greatest form, like it continues. So that's a why that's large enough. That's large enough. And it's even more significant than my continued existence, my survival, my individual survival. So if you put that together, you train people to be able to reframe, to look, because if you give someone tragedy, lots of it, and it overwhelms their coping mechanisms and they've got nothing and they can see no clear way out. There's no hope, nothing. So that's too much. And when you describe people on those islands, if the challenge is too great that they have no sense of their own agency, like I can actually do something to change things, make it better and survive. If you don't give them some sense of like, why am I even trying to do this? You know, sometimes I guess they're doing it like someone says, you get $1 million if you win. Sometimes, you know, if you say to somebody, because you got to get back to civilization because you're carrying this message that needs to, you know, you have the last vial of this antidote to something. I mean, that's a different motivation. So, but those are the kinds of things that if we're training our children, training our students, training society well, we're giving them a large enough why where, you know, we can't control this, like the magnitude of the tragedy to which they're exposed. But if you strengthen them in those other ways, it's unreal what they can survive. It's unreal what they can triumph over. And triumphing doesn't mean, you know, you can't go back in time. Bruce Wayne can't bring his parents back to life. But what he can do is he says, you know, when I was a kid, I used to think about this, like, what vow did he take? So in one of the comic books, it says, you know, he says, he's sitting next to his bed, he's kneeling, and his great uncle Philip says to him, make sure you say your prayers, boy. He says, I do every night. I do every night. And he says, please, God, please allow me to be successful, like to do, you know, to train, because what I want to do is make sure, I'd like to prevent as many of those tragedies as happening to other people as I possibly can. The reason I like that particular formulation, because there's a bunch of portrayals over a lot of issues. He finished, he says, please, God, help me to do that. And like, to me, like that sense of we work as hard as we can. We need the creator of the universe, the Almighty, to crown our efforts with success, because that gives us a certain degree of humility. But if we have all those ingredients, if everything in the mix is the right proportion, people can accomplish extraordinary things, extraordinary things.
You know who didn't accomplish extraordinary things? Duke basketball this year. Busted my bracket. But
I was a little surprised.
they did pretty good, but they let me down just a little bit. So
I grew up in Connecticut, though, so
yeah.
I'm right. So I was a little torn because I have a lot of warm feelings for Duke. I was there for a long time, and we still have friends there. But UConn Stores isn't that far away from where I grew up, so I was a little torn.
Okay, so well, I bring up Duke, but yeah, I feel like you kind of skimmed over your time at the prison, and I think you were at the prison while you were writing Wisdom from the Batcave. Were you reflecting on these prisoners, you're spending time around former criminals? Was that part of the approach or the journey?
Good question. I'll tell you a story. I think about it till today, and I use it in a lot of my classes that I give to the cops, especially. One day, I was walking out at the end of it was a tough place. The people there were primarily sex crime offenders. So that was a certain kind of population. And it was tough. I mean, the first time I went in there, I'm telling you all my most embarrassing stories and but the first day I walked in, I was met by the head chaplain, Chaplain Morton, one of the nicest people, one of the most just an extraordinary human being, one of the nicest people I've ever met, one of the strongest people I've ever met. And he was the chief chaplain there, the head chaplain there for a long time. So he met me, and we went through a number of electronic checkpoints. We get inside into the actual, like within the facility itself, and people are generally like walking around, interacting. It's not like, everybody's behind bars in a cell or things like that. It's like an open air kind of place. And I saw behavior. My brain shut down and my body shut down. And I froze. I went like this, and I couldn't move. Like my brain shut down. So Chaplain Morton had two guards. They picked me up like under the elbows and they carried me back out through the electronic checkpoints and down the little pathway. And then there was this long parking lot. They didn't know which was my car. So they left me right at the opening of the parking lot. And they were like, you're going to be able to, and I was like, oh. And you're gonna, and they stood there like maybe, I don't know, a little bit or whatever, and they walked back in. I managed to unfreeze, and I went to my car. I opened my car, opened the door, I got in, and I started to cry. I just cried. And I had a sense of the capacity, the human capacity for evil. I grew up in a home hearing stories about the Holocaust, but I grew up in a home where my parents demanded from their children like dignity. We conducted ourselves a certain way. We spoke a certain way. We dressed a certain way. We interacted with people a certain way. And the other stuff that I knew was just kind of an intellectual thing, theoretical, really, to me. It had been pretty powerful and been pretty traumatic all at the same time. But I had never really come face to face with something. And the kind of behavior, there's no way I would ever, I won't articulate, I won't describe but the kind of behaviors that I saw, the betrayal of what I was talking before about, like the inherent, the potential, the nobility, the dignity of a human being. I sat in the car and I wept. And I went home. I was a little shaky driving home, but at some point I drove home. I walked into the house and my wife had just come home from work. It was like later in the afternoon. And because I went after I'd done my stuff at Duke for the day, whatever. And she said, are you okay? And I walked right by her and went to my room and I went to sleep. My brain shut down. My brain shut down. I tell you that story, not just because I got an endless number of stories where I look like a doofus head. You never ever see me with like stopping a runaway train or thing. It's always me being like, like think like, oh my gosh, this poor guy is such a Neb monster. But the reason I tell you is because I want to communicate like the intensity, like who these people are, right? The kind of like, this is the clientele. All right. So now, a couple years later, I was there for, I think I was there for 4 years, 5 years, maybe 4 years. I'm walking out one night. And as I'm walking out, I'd go into a certain place and there were some threatening behavior, whatever, like that. So I would have two guards would go in with me. My Jewish identity, that kind of stuff was a little threatening to some people. And it was a little, so they assigned me. So these two fellows, big, burly, guys, that was wonderful. So we're walking out. And as we walk by near, there's like a long glass window. And you can see in like a kind of a lounge. And they were showing a movie. And these guys were there and they're watching the Batman movie from 1989 with Michael Keaton.
Yeah.
Right? It was with Michael Keaton. So he's gotten some guy who, I don't remember what crime the guy committed, but Batman is like, has him hanging upside down and he's harassing the guy or something like that. He's giving this guy some, curbside justice or something. And as we're walking by and I see that on the screen, and I remember the scene from when I'd seen the movie some years earlier, and the guys are all in there and they're cheering for the Batman. They're all cheering Batman. They're going, yeah, my man, give it. Yeah, that's right. That's right. He did. Yeah, that's right. Upside the head. You give it to that guy. Right? And I was looking at it and I was shocked. They should be cheering for the bad guy to get away, to turn the tables. Maybe Batman will slip because it's been a rainy evening and on the precipice he'll slip, or there'll be a banana peel and the guy will get the better of him, he'll get away. Like, why are they cheering for Batman? So I stopped and I was dumbfounded. I couldn't figure it out. Like, here was a problem that had been presented to me and I couldn't figure out what was happening. So I just stood there. So the two guards were there and I was a little friendly with them, whatever. We used to chat a little bit, whatever. And finally one of them said, what's the problem? And I said, I can't make sense of this scene. I just can't make sense of this scene. I said, they're much worse than this guy. And they're cheering Batman, giving it to him. The Batman would give it to, they're much, much worse. They're 1,000 times worse. I don't understand. They're cheering for the wrong guy in their values, in their world. One of the guards said something which was so profound. He said to me, you totally don't understand these people. So he said to me, you totally understand them. He said, you know what it is? He said, every one of these guys, they think they're Batman. He said, every one of them, if you say to them, why did you do that? Why did that? He said, they'll start by saying, he disrespected me. They wronged me. And I need to see that I had to see that justice was done. They wronged me. They needed to be punished. He says, and the guard said to me, he says, and when society failed, he said, you know how many times, like he says, somebody would key the side of their car. He said, they take a baseball bat and they crush the guy's skull. He said, but they were provoked. And the fact is that there was no mechanism that law enforcement had. They couldn't bring that guy to justice. They keyed the car, but there were no witnesses. There were no fingerprints. They never even did a crime. They never dusted for print, nothing. They said, oh, the guy said, we can take a report, but there's not much we can do about it. And the guy said, oh, really? There might not be much you can do, but I can avenge this. So the guy said, every one of those people, if you look at them, he said, the endless capacity, listen to the insight of a guard. He said, the endless capacity that every one of these people has to rationalize away, to justify why their behavior makes it that they are the unsung hero. They're more like Batman. If you really were to know all the facts, you would come away and you would say, we should be celebrating your adventures, your exploits. And it's not right that you're here in jail. So what I learned that day, and I thought about it, and I was thunderstruck. It's genius, isn't it? It's genius. So I thanked him. And what I came to, and I was sensitized to this because what I've seen is that people have an endless capacity to justify their behavior. Like, every person is endowed with enormous intellect. And so much of our thinking is propaganda for our appetites. Eric Hoffer said that. The philosopher Eric Hoffer said, most of a man's thinking is propaganda for his appetites. Person wants to do something. And they say to themselves, well, that's not, well, actually, really. And they start using this genius mind. We're all endowed with genius intellects. They start using it to come up with propaganda, at the end of which they say, oh, yeah. So you know what? It's not only that I'm allowed to, I really ought to. It's the only decent thing for me to do is to do whatever. So when I teach with my police officers and I teach them about maintaining their integrity, because they live in a world where there's a lot of shifting sands of a lot of things, and it would be very easy for them to get lost and to justify and rationalize all kinds of behavior. The criminal justice system fails, and the administrators, the police executives fail them, and they can do a lot of things. They can take a lot of things into their own hands. So I make it clear to them always, we talk about that they have to have a source of values that is absolute, an absolute source of value. It has to be external to and higher than themselves. It has to be an absolute source of values. And that absolute is defined by right external to and higher than themselves. Because Ernest Hemingway once made a comment. He said, "What's moral is what I feel good after." Now, if you think about that, that's disgusting. What's moral, if I feel good after I did it, you know those guys in the prison? They felt good. Every one of them felt good after they did what they did. And I say to my police students, you spend your whole career arresting people who feel great after they do what they did. Obviously, that's not the criterion. If I feel good after I did it. So we have exercises where we define what is the source of values. And the source for that exercise, all of that came from that afternoon that I was walking out of the prison, and I saw them cheering the Batman and the guard explaining it to me. In terms of other lessons, I won't belabor and spend so much time, but I learned that a lot of the people there, when people relate to them, to their internal, like their dignity, that image of God in which everyone is created, if someone relates to them that way, it doesn't mean people turn around, but they would play up to the bar more than I would have originally thought, because everybody's got that inherent that intrinsic greatness. A lot of people in society were never taught how to use it, and they were taught how to misuse it and how to misinterpret the signals around them. And even at a late date, when I tried to behave with them with respect, with dignity, with kindness, I wasn't naive. I never dropped my guard, because they tried to manipulate me, and we would have class. They couldn't, but they would try. But if I was with wisdom, I dealt with them respectfully, and I related to them on a level higher than they would have otherwise. And I would say, I'll meet you on this plane. They would meet me on that plane.
Yeah.
So those lessons from the Batman book, it's easy to identify a lot of these. It's easy to identify a lot of these lessons when everybody is living, in a safe place. Everything is great. The sun is smiling. But when it turns dark and the context is pretty grim and pretty tough, these lessons are still true. And that was something that I tried a lot of these out on the people with whom I interacted in the prison. And I believe that they work even in the toughest of conditions. I think they're still effective and powerful. That's a good question. Thank you. Thank you for making me remember that.
This is the Winning Wellness Podcast. So my goal is to collect as many pieces of advice for people to be well. Maybe it's athletes to win, or maybe it's your neighbor to lose a little bit of weight and feel better and they're becoming more well, or whatever it is. You have your own fitness and martial arts background. You have your spiritual background, your religious background. You have the Batman expertise. Use any of it or use none of it. But what do you think people need to do to win well?
I think that, it was interesting to me when the Department of Justice tasked the behavioral science unit, and they came back and they said, wow, it never even would have occurred to us the role of spirituality, the spiritual dimension. We never even acknowledged, we never realized its existence. I think that that's the key. Carl Jung, I think he was a student of Freud, but he wrote towards the end of his life, he said, as I look back now over my career, I counseled thousands and thousands of people. He said, what I realize now is that in the final analysis, it was kind of shocking that he wrote this, but he says, in the final analysis, for almost all of them, the question, the dilemma, and the solution all took place on the spiritual or religious plane. And then for a psychologist, there were a lot of secularists. That wasn't what he was expecting when he started his career. So I think that to deal on the level of spirituality, people tend to kind of give that short shrift. They ignore it. They think like, oh, I'm not one of those kind of people. I'm not religious by nature. I'm not peddling here. I'm not on today to talk about being religious. Like I said before, spirituality, you can talk on that plane. Each one of us has that something within us the human spirit, we can call it, to avoid any religious terminology, but the human spirit, which is the source of those desires, but much more than a desire, a need to stand to live a life that has meaning. It's not that we want to. It's I have a desire to live a life of meaning. The human being needs to live a life of meaning. And I think the real challenge is for a person to identify for themselves in their own life a source of meaning, a sense of mission that's important to them. Like, what am I doing here? What am I supposed to accomplish? That's the organizing principle. And if a person has that large enough why, if it's powerful enough, it can be used to make sense of everything. So for a person to say, like, why should I get out of bed and go work out? Why should I eat well? Why should I be honest at this moment when the cameras are off and no one is looking? Why should I behave like a decent person to my spouse, my children, to my neighbor? Why should I do anything? And usually the real test is when no one is looking and a person is alone. So if a person can turn inward and say, what is my why? And to be running on automatic pilot without any why is the scariest thing that I could imagine. And I've known people who foundered on the rocks because of that, like at a key moment, a crucial moment, there was a bump in the road, and without a why, people fall apart. But if you find a why that's strong enough, that's powerful enough, it will motivate you to do everything, to take care of the physical aspect of yourself, to take care of the emotional aspect, the intellectual, the spiritual, the ethical, all of that. So I would say find that why and make sure that it's a real large one. It's the kind of thing that's going to keep you all the time going back to the well and drawing more capacity from yourself. Don't choose some little one that will require one trip to the well and you say, oh, I had the resources that I needed. I was able to do it. Mission accomplished. No, it's the kind of thing where you say, oh, this is tough. And you go back and a bucket goes down into the well, and more nobility of character, more greatness of the human spirit comes out, and you just keep doing it. You just keep doing it. That would be the best advice I can give. And I think that that's especially true, like I said before, to give to young people, to the people who are impressionable. It's always possible, at any age, I think, to recover it. But that is a message for children, for our children, for our students, for society. I think that is the source for lots of wellness, God willing.
Thank you for that. And if people want to get a hold of you, or you've written several books, is there any material that you're putting out? Is there a good website or anything for them to access you?
Yeah, there is. I think the website is spiritualsurvivalforlawenforcement.com. That's a reasonably new website. Some of the websites we're transitioning, and I am associate director of the Law Enforcement Survival Institute. We have had a number of websites. Unfortunately, this is really, really sad. The executive director, John Marks, passed away a few months ago, and the organization is kind of reconfiguring. Those websites are laying fallow a little bit, which is really kind of sad. But I think that my personal that website, spiritualsurvivalforlawenforcement.com, that's a pretty good way to do it. There are, I believe, in the Wisdom from the Batcave book, I think there's an email address that I think is still active. But I can be reached at, I believe my email address is CaryF, CaryF, at lawenforcementsurvivalinstitute.org. And that will get to me. I also can be reached at chaplainCary at gmail.com. So those things will go right to my, I get them directly. And if people are interested, this is not necessarily a law enforcement audience that's watching, but the model that I created for the behavioral science unit is true for every human being. I call it the 3 accounts of spirituality. And it's just that the withdrawals and the deposits that police officers, first responders need to make are just more intense they're larger, things like that. But there's material in this book, Spiritual Survival, which is, I think, pretty good for anybody. This is, I'm really proud of this because it's a distillation of everything that we do at the Law Enforcement Survival Institute. So each of the chapters represents a different aspect. There's a chapter on developing the physical to the pretty high levels, the mental, the intellectual, the emotional, the spiritual, the ethical, and it's the distillation of wisdom from 27 faculty members, I think 22 faculty members that LESI has. So if that helps anybody, I would be really happy to know that. And please, I invite anybody who watches, I invite you, please get in touch with me. I'd love to hear from you. chaplainCary at Gmail, that's just a lot less letters than the other one, but write to me and I will do my absolute best. I have a pretty good track record. I do respond. So I'll look forward to hearing from you. And thank you for inviting me to be on this podcast. I really enjoyed it.
Thank you for all your time and the work that you've done, the storytelling that you told today. I think in the counseling world, I was told about a saying. They say, just take care of your corner of the world. And the way that Batman takes care of Gotham, but thank you for taking care of your corner of the world with whether it's prisoners or college students or the law enforcement individuals, and then now sharing this with us, and hopefully we can get to a few more ears in the near future.
That would be great. Thank you so much. What an honor, what a privilege to be on this podcast. I mean, I really enjoyed it.
Thank you for listening to the Winning Wellness Podcast. Please keep in mind that all views expressed within the show are not a reflection of any universities or organizations that I may be affiliated with. If you have any questions or suggestions for future shows, please reach out through Instagram, where I can be found with the title name of Mitch Schwartzman.